fourthly, on the grading rubric, you'll see that your organization is going to be extremely important. And one of the things I want to stress a whole lot is that a good organization can make or break a paper. When I used to write papers, I would just sit down and just start writing. And I never really wrote outlines. And it wasn't until later that I realized how important a good outline is for a paper. What an outline basically enables you to do is to see the entirety of your paper all in one sitting, and you can see how the various parts hang and function together. And it's good, in my opinion, to have multiple outlines. Like I'll a lot of times write a very general outline for the whole paper, and then I'll come back and I'll slowly outline each section separately, just so I can see how the parts of each section function as a whole. And this is going to count for 20% of your grade. How well organized is your paper? And I'll go ahead and tell you that most every single philosophy paper is going to have a very similar general format. And the format of your paper should be something like as follows. You're going to have your introduction, which we've already covered, and your introduction should probably be one. Some people are a little more long-winded. I could see an introduction being 2 paragraphs, but certainly no longer than that. But your introduction should be at least 1 paragraph. And then you're going to have a detailed exposition of the positions and arguments that you're going to discuss. And so here you're going to talk about, you're going to explain what cultural relativism is. You're going to explain what moral realism is. You're going to explain the 3 arguments for cultural relativism. You're going to explain James Rachel's criticisms of these. And so this detailed exposition section of your paper is probably going to be at least, I would say, 1.5 pages to 2.5 pages. This is going to be the bulk of your paper. And you may recall a while ago I said that if you listen to what I say, your paper will kind of more or less write itself, and this is what I had in mind. This section of your paper is going to be at least half of your paper, and it's going to be you just basically going back and looking at the PowerPoint slides and looking at the readings and summarizing what has been said. This is a very critical part of your paper. And then once you're done with this, then what you're going to do is you're going to provide your arguments. Hey, I agree with James Rachel's, I disagree with James Rachel's, whatever your arguments happen to be. Then you're going to state possible objections to your arguments. We were just talking about this when we talked about anticipating problems. Here again, you need to state at least 1, I would say maybe 2 or 3 main objections with your paper. Then once you've stated those, and this should take, I would guess, maybe a paragraph for section 4, then you would state your responses to those. And again, that might take up a paragraph, and then you would have your conclusion. Now, the truth is your paper doesn't even really need a conclusion. You could get by without doing one. A lot of students like to include it, but it's not essential. The other parts of it are, now I have these listed, in this order, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Things don't in your paper necessarily have to flow in this kind of sequence necessarily. It doesn't have to be this linear. Like a lot of times what will happen is that students will combine sections 3, 4, and 5. Like they'll provide their arguments, and while they're providing their arguments, they'll say, well, here's an objection and here's my response, and they'll do a little bit of back and forth like that. And that's fine. But these elements need to be included. You can either have it in a very linear fashion, as I have it listed here, where you move through each section of your paper, or you could give a little back and forth also, and that would be fine. But your paper does need to include these different elements in it. All right, number 5, we come to writing style. And writing style is very, very important for your paper. And as you can see, your writing style is going to be graded for 20% of your total grade. And when it comes to good writing style, and you probably have gotten a sense of this already from some of the things you've read in class, for me, good writing style is just using simple, direct sentences. I don't want you to use very complex sentence structures. Just write very, very simple sentence structures. And I have this kind of a tip here, but I say and kind of somewhat in jest and somewhat seriously, if it sounds like a third grader wrote it, you're probably on the right track. And the reason I say that is because sometimes people have this tendency to write these very long, elaborate sentences, but they're really confusing and hard to understand. And the reality is, you could condense those sentences and make them much more direct, much more straightforward, and it would communicate information a lot more effectively. Remember, your goal is to communicate information as easily as possible to the person who is reading it. You're not trying to confuse them at all, so you want to simplify as much as possible. So let me give you a few examples to illustrate what I have in mind. So here's a sentence. For this essay, I would like to use what information I found to provide reason why I support the fine-tuning argument and why I can explain the creation of the universe at the hands of a higher being. Now, what is this person saying? This is something that's actually, it would be good if you paused it right now, the presentation, and tried to figure out for yourself. It's actually a little bit confusing what they're trying to say. There's a lot of information in here that's just not even necessary. So for instance, again, they say, I will use what information I found. Well, that's a given. I mean, obviously you're going to use information you found. So this part right here, you don't even need. I mean, what are you going to write a paper using information you didn't find? That doesn't make any sense. I will provide reason for why I support the fine-tuning argument. Okay, basically all of this is a long-winded way of saying something that can be reduced to something a lot simpler, which is just this. In this essay, I will defend the fine-tuning argument. You could add, if you wanted, to say, in this essay, I will defend the fine-tuning argument for God's existence, and that would add a little more clarity. But the reality is all of this right here could be boiled down to just this. Now, like I said, you could, if you want to, add for God's existence right here, and it would add a little more clarity, but that's not even essential. And so this is what I was talking about writing more like a third grader in a way, or simplifying things. Try to cut out words in your sentences if you can. If 3 words will communicate what you need to say, don't use 5 words. Just simplify your sentence structure when you're writing. I'll give you a few more examples. Here's another one. For all we can know, a moderately unclear paper may reflect only the difficulty of the subject or the grader's own unfamiliarity with the experience of the writer, when the writer has presumed in him a background that he does not in fact have. Now that's really complicated, and the funny thing about this is this actually came from a philosophy book where the person was trying to teach people on how to write with good style. And what he said was this was the first sentence in one chapter, and then he realized, like, wait, what the hell am I saying? I don't even know. And so he went back and he clarified it, and it's just this. For all we know, a moderately unclear paper may reflect only the difficulty of the subject or the reader's unfamiliarity with it. And notice, I mean, this is just a very simplified way of saying everything that was contained in this first sentence. If it's unnecessary information, if it's wordy, if it goes back and forth, cut it out. Simplify your sentences. All right, one final example. And so, actually, I might have 2 final examples, but here's another example. Morality, or lack thereof, determines the amount of harmony or duress within our day-to-day interactions with society. 2 generalized theories in play are moral realism and cultural relativism. Moral realism is the theory of right and wrong behaviors and ideas, which are based on some objective truths. Now, in my opinion, this is really long, and all of this could be reduced to saying just this. Moral realism and cultural relativism are 2 theories of morality. Moral realism holds that there are some objective moral truths. I don't really think the first sentence in here really honestly makes a lot of sense, and I don't think it's essential. What's essential is just this information that's communicated right here. And like I said, I mean, this right here, what I'm saying that you should say, might sound just really cut and dry and really boring. To me, it's sexy. To me, I really like it. I like how easy it is to read and how easy it is to understand, and I definitely prefer it to someone who's being very wordy and containing a whole lot of unnecessary information in their writing style. Another point about writing style is your sentence, not just structure, but redundancy. Don't say the same thing twice. Don't repeat yourself. Don't just, say the same thing multiple times. I'm making a joke here that no one ever gets, but just don't repeat yourself is the basic point. And you can do this in several ways. I mean, one way you might just, in a paragraph, literally repeat the same information that you just said. And I've seen students do this. I think they're just trying to take up space. But even within a single sentence, sometimes people can repeat themselves or be redundant. So here's an example. I have a friend who's a vegetarian and will not eat meat. Now this is redundant. And why? Because a vegetarian, by definition, is someone who doesn't eat meat. Now, I know some people call themselves vegetarian who eat fish, but technically that's not a vegetarian, that's a pescatarian. A vegetarian is by definition someone who doesn't eat meat. So all you need to say is, I have a friend who's a vegetarian. Adding this clause, and will not eat meat, that's just redundant. Here's another example. What this country needs is a respect for moral and ethical standards. Well, this is also redundant because moral and ethical mean the exact same thing. And so all you need to say is what this country needs is a respect for moral standards. Now, I know you're just cutting out two words, and ethical, but if you can cut out even two words, that just makes your sentence that much more direct and that much more to the point. So this is what I'm trying to communicate when it comes to writing style, in particular your sentence structure. Make sure that you just condense things if at all possible. And when I say condense things, what I mean is within the sentence themselves. Don't sacrifice content at all, but if you can express the same content with 4 words instead of 5, then use 4 words. Have your sentences just direct, straightforward, to the point. Now, in addition to your sentence structures, language use is also extremely important. And the words you use can be just as important as the content themselves. And I think when I was younger and I was learning to write papers, I confused good writing with using big words. And I think I'm going to fault my high school teachers with this because I would write papers and the only comments I would get back a lot of times would just be like circled, a word I use and like, nice word. And so I'd get like an A on the paper and I was like, oh, if I use big words, that means I'm doing a good job. But that's not true at all. In fact, using big words a lot of times can be really counterproductive to what you're trying to do. Remember, you're trying to communicate information. And what I want to tell you, the main rule for word use is that you need to use the most suitable word to communicate exactly the idea you want. And notice that different words communicate slightly different ideas. If I say someone is sad, well, that's a lot different than saying they're depressed. And that's a whole lot different than saying they're distraught. If I say someone is stressed, that's a lot different than saying they're bothered or they're worried. And you need to pick exactly the words you want to communicate exactly the idea that you want. You're trying to direct the reader to a particular outcome, and every little word you use, you're guiding them towards that direction. So be very, very careful when you choose words. Make sure you choose the most appropriate word to communicate exactly what you want. And going back to what I was saying earlier, sometimes this requires a big word. Sometimes there's no small word that's going to communicate exactly what you want to say. One of my favorite big words is the word schadenfreude. This is a word that some of you may not have heard of before, but schadenfreude, it's a word we don't actually, it's not even an English word, it's a German word. But we use it in English language because we don't have an English equivalent. And what schadenfreude is, it is when you delight in the suffering of someone else. I don't know, it sounds so terrible, but I'm sure some of you, maybe you've known like a coworker and you're like, I can't stand that person. And finally they got what was coming to them and you're like, yes, they got what they deserved. And when you have that feeling, that's known as schadenfreude. And we don't have an English word for that. So if you wanted to communicate that idea to someone else, you're going to have to use that word because there's no small word equivalent. So sometimes you have to use a big word, but sometimes a small word will do. And if a small word will do, it's just go ahead and use that word. Don't scroll through the thesaurus on Microsoft Word and substitute a big word for every small word, because it just makes your paper hard to read at times, and it sounds pretentious. I remember I had a professor once who said to me, he's like, "Nice introduction, but a little heavy on the highfalutin language." And he was making fun of me because I'd basically done exactly what I'm telling you not to do. I'd substituted a lot of big fancy words in place for ordinary words that would have communicated exactly what I wanted to say just fine. Oh, and here I have it up here. I forgot I had it on this slide. Take it easy on the highfalutin language. Yeah, I got that from a professor who was making fun of me. And, I've been saying this already, and I just kind of want to reiterate the point is, don't mistake good writing with the big vocabulary. They're not the same. Just because you use a lot of words doesn't mean you're doing a lot of big words, doesn't mean your writing is very good. You should avoid sesquipedalian terminology because it obfuscates meaning. And that was a joke. It was probably not a very funny one. But hopefully you can see, you might have read that point and heard me saying, like, what the heck is he talking? Sesquillian terminology. Sesquipedalian is actually the big word for big words. It means words that are a foot and a half in length. And so you can see here my point when I say that it obfuscates meaning, that it hinders meaning, is that when you use big words, a lot of times the other person doesn't really know what you're talking about. It doesn't really communicate anything to them because they're unfamiliar with the words. So if I just said big words make your meaning unclear, you can see that would have communicated a lot more effectively what it is I was trying to say. Another problem that you run into is when you use big words, sometimes you run the risk of misusing words that you're unfamiliar with. I've noticed this a lot of times that students will try to use big words, and I've done this too. I don't want to just pick on students, but you'll use a word that you've heard, it sounds really fancy, but you end up saying something that's not quite right. You use the word in a way that's somewhat imprecise, and so you end up just sounding kind of silly. And so my point here is if you're thinking of using a word, if it's something you would never say, if you just would never see yourself saying it, don't write it, because there's a good chance that you'll end up just misusing it and saying something that's kind of silly, and you don't want to do that. Every time you say something kind of silly in your paper, that just takes a little bit away from the overall persuasive force of what it is you're trying to say. On the other hand, just because you would say it doesn't mean you should write it. You shouldn't use any kind of profanity or slang or anything like that in your paper. Remember, you're writing for a professional audience. That's why I have this guy here, he's putting on his tie, he's putting on his Sunday best. And keep in mind, when you're writing this paper, you need to write for a professional audience. You probably have noticed that we speak differently in different contexts. Some people might say this is hypocritical, but it's not. It's just a reality of life. When you're around your friends, you use one kind of tone and one kind of language. When you're talking to, a professor, or you're talking to your boss or something like that, you use a different kind of language around them. And when you're talking with a professional colleague, you use a different kind of tone, a different kind of language. And that's what I'm saying for your paper. Make sure that the language you use is the appropriate level of professional for what you're trying to do. I had a student once, you have to forgive my language, what I'm about to say, but he, in his paper, he wrote something to the effect, he's like, I think Socrates is just an asshole. And I was like, wait, dude, you can't say that. If we're just talking in class, you might say that, we might get a kick out of it, but your paper is written for a professional audience, so keep that in mind. Write for the appropriate level for your paper. One final thing I'm going to say about your language use is to avoid overly strong language in your paper. And sometimes what I'll encounter is that students will use words that are really, really strong. And they'll say things like, I want to prove moral realism is true. And the problem with doing stuff like this is when you say something like you're going to prove, that word prove is a very strong word. And if you, by the end of your paper, you haven't actually proven that moral realism is true, then you failed to accomplish what it is you said you were going to accomplish. And so that completely undermines what it is you're doing. You're going to be graded based on, do you accomplish the things that you set out? Do you achieve the goals that you set out for yourself? So a simple way to avoid failing to accomplish your goal is just to use language that's not quite as strong. So instead of saying, I will prove moral realism is true, say, I will defend moral realism. And that's something, in a way, as long as you provide some level of argumentation for moral realism, you've successfully accomplished your goal. Now, have you accomplished your goal well, or have you accomplished it poorly? That's going to be a separate question. But saying I will defend moral realism, that's not quite as strong as saying I will prove it. It's something that's more manageable, more easily done. Here's another example. James Rachels refutes this argument. Well, refute means to prove that it's false. And that's, again, something that's really hard to do. Now, sometimes, maybe sometimes people do completely refute another point, but that honestly occurs very rarely. So instead of saying that you'll refute, because that's such a strong word, use a word that's not quite as strong. Say rejects. And that's something that's true. James Rachels may very well reject this particular argument. To reject an argument just means that you believe that it's wrong and you provided an argument to show that. It doesn't have to be a good argument. Reject is something that I personally attempt to do. But to refute something, that means that I've actually proven that it's false. So this is the final thing I want to say about language use, is just make sure that your language isn't overly strong. So that basically sums up everything I want to say for your paper. I don't think I have a slide on this, but the final thing that you're going to be graded on for your paper is your grammar. Now, grammar is only going to count for 5% of your total grade. Keep in mind that you can run a spelling and grammar check, and you can do this in Word. And it really, really annoys me when students don't run the spelling and grammar check because it's so easy to do. As 5% of your total grade, and having poor grammar can, if you don't run the spelling and grammar check, I'm just going to go ahead and deduct the 5% off the top. So that's an easy way, I think, to not get deducted. Just run the spelling and grammar check. If you're having problems with grammar, there's a writing center at TCC, and they can actually help you iron out any kind of grammatical problems.